In 1944, a photograph appeared in the pages of the Life magazine that stopped readers cold. The woman in it was not a Hollywood actress or a society matron. She was a factory worker in a Cincinnati munitions plant, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a rivet gun balanced across her knees. But what the editorial department had not anticipated, and what letters from readers would confirm for weeks afterward, was that no one could stop talking about her hair. Pinned high above each temple in two magnificent cylindrical rolls, gleaming with lacquer and precision, the style swept back from her face like a pair of wings preparing for liftoff. The caption beneath the photograph named her Betty Kowalski. History forgot her last name almost immediately. The hairstyle did not forget anything. The victory roll was, at its core, an act of controlled extravagance at a moment when extravagance was otherwise impossible. Fabric was rationed. Sugar was rationed. Nylon, which women had only just discovered in stockings, vanished overnight into parachutes, but hair was free. It grew without coupons. It could be shaped with cold water and a little ingenuity, pinned into architecture that announced without a single word that beauty was a form of resistance, and American women seized on it with the particular ferocity of people who have been told that pleasure must wait. Pleasure, they decided, would not wait. It would sit directly on top of their heads. The mechanics of the roll itself were deceptively demanding. To achieve the smooth, tubular shape that photographs from the era display so effortlessly, a woman first needed to section off the hair at the temples and above the forehead, isolating perhaps 2 to 3 inches on each side. This section was then combed meticulously for snags, because a snagged roll telegraphed effort, and effort was something the style was designed to conceal. The hair was then rolled inward and upward, always inward and upward, around the finger, or, for women with access to a small cylindrical form, around a padded curler or a simple cotton roll stuffed with the wearer's own shed hair. This last technique, known domestically as a rat, had been in use since the Edwardian era, but the 1940s gave it renewed purpose. Nothing went to waste in wartime, not even the contents of the hairbrush. Once the roll was formed, it was pinned flat against the skull with a battery of bobby pins, typically 6 to 8 per side for a moderate-sized roll, more for the dramatic versions that some women preferred to extend almost to the crown. The pins were inserted at opposing angles, crossing each other beneath the roll to create a lattice of grip. A single pin in one direction would simply pull out under the weight of a full workday. The crossed method held through 12-hour shifts, through lunch in a canteen, through the walk home in February wind. Women learned this through trial and error, through collapsed rolls discovered in a bathroom mirror at noon, through the quiet advice exchanged between co-workers at adjacent lockers. What emerged from this labour was a silhouette that carried enormous symbolic weight. The rolls lifted the hair away from the face, opening the features, creating a visual clarity that was simultaneously functional and theatrical. With hair secured away from the forehead and temples, a woman operating heavy machinery faced less hazard. With hair arranged in a shape that borrowed its vocabulary from architectural curves rather than from the soft waves of the pre-war era, she also looked, and this word was used frequently in the fashion press, capable. Not merely beautiful, not merely well-groomed, but capable. The word appeared in a 1943 editorial in Harper's Bazaar describing what the magazine called the new working woman's aesthetic, and it landed with the weight of a cultural verdict. The name itself has been the subject of considerable debate among historians of fashion and linguistics. The most durable explanation holds that the style was named in honour of the Allied victories accumulating across the European theatre, a small domestic ceremony performed each morning at the vanity mirror in tribute to battles being won on the other side of the Atlantic. Some women pinned small newspaper clippings of those victories into the undersides of their rolls, invisible tallies carried through a work day. This detail appears in at least 2 published memoirs from women who worked in textile factories in New Jersey and Ohio, and while it may carry the warm glow of retrospective myth-making, it captures something true about the relationship between women's bodies and the war effort. The sense that every inch of a woman's presentation was freighted with meaning in those years was available for conscription into a larger story. Hairdressers of the period, working from salons that had shed half their male stylists to military drafts, adapted quickly to the demand. Advertisements in trade publications like the National Beauty School Journal from 1942 through 1945 show an increasing number of how-to diagrams devoted to upswept styles, and the victory roll appears with growing frequency under a variety of names: the barrel curl, the wartime sweep, the high front roll. Before the victory designation solidified into common usage by mid-decade, salon appointments for the style ran approximately 45 minutes, which was considered efficient, and the results were designed to hold for 3 to 4 days under a net sleeping cap, making the time investment reasonable for women working schedules that left little margin. The women who wore it most conspicuously were perhaps not those in the factories, though they were the ones who got the photographs, but the women performing in the USO tours that moved through American military bases at home and abroad. Performers like Frances Langford and the dancers who accompanied Bob Hope's travelling shows wore the victory roll on stage, under hot lights that bleached ordinary styling into shapelessness, and the rolled cylinders held their geometry. This was the style's great practical virtue. It was theatrical without being fragile, glamorous without requiring refrigeration. A woman could wear a victory roll through a 3-hour show, through a receiving line afterward, through photographs with 100 young soldiers who each wanted a keepsake. The roll would still be there, still gleaming when the bus pulled away at midnight. By 1947, as the war receded and the culture pivoted toward what Dior would call the new look, that voluminous, wasp-waisted silhouette that seemed to will women back into drawing rooms, the victory roll began to soften and lower. The high, dramatic architecture flattened into something called the page boy, and later into the sculptured finger waves that suited the cinched dresses and full skirts of the early post-war years. But the victory roll did not disappear so much as go underground, surviving in beauty school textbooks as a foundational technique, reappearing on the stages of rockabilly clubs in the mid-1950s, and surfacing again with tremendous force in the 1980s and 90s as the neo-swing movement rediscovered what that Cincinnati riveter had always known: that a woman who controls the geometry of her own hair controls something important, something that no ration book and no cultural decree can reach. To do the victory roll today, and it remains entirely achievable with fingers, pins and patience, is to participate in an act of historical continuity that most people perform unconsciously. The technique has not changed. The hair is sectioned at the temples. The roll is formed inward and upward. The pins cross. What changes is the context, which is to say, what changes is everything, and nothing at all. The shape above your forehead is the same shape that appeared in that Life magazine photograph in 1944. Betty Kowalski would recognize it. The physical tools required for the victory roll have changed very little in 8 decades, which is one of the remarkable things about it. The rat-tail comb remains the ideal instrument for sectioning the hair cleanly at the temples, its pointed end precise enough to draw a line through the hair without disturbing the sections on either side. Bobby pins, still sold in the same basic configuration that women of the 1940s would recognize instantly, remain the fastening mechanism of choice, and the setting spray that contemporary practitioners apply to the wound sections before pinning them in place is the conceptual descendant of the setting lotion. The liquids made from gum tragacanth or quince seed gel that wartime women applied to damp hair to help it hold its set through the demands of a 12-hour factory shift. What has changed is the relationship between the practitioner and the technique. In 1944, the victory roll was something a woman learned from the women around her, from her mother, her co-worker, her neighbour who had seen it done at the salon, in the same way that she learned to make a pie crust or iron a shirt collar. Through watching and doing, through the kind of embodied knowledge transfer that happens when one person's hands are observed by another person who will later use those same movements. Beauty schools of the period included the victory roll in their upswept styling curricula, but most women encountered it not in a classroom but at a kitchen table or in front of a shared bathroom mirror, one person talking through the steps while another attempted to replicate them. The knowledge was communal property. Contemporary instructional content on the victory roll exists primarily on video sharing platforms, which represents both a continuity and a departure. The technique being taught is identical. The mechanism of transmission is entirely different. A woman in a rural town in 1944 who wanted to learn the victory roll needed to know another woman who knew it. A woman in the same location today can find 25 tutorial videos of varying quality within 3 minutes. The democratization of technique has been genuinely achieved. What has perhaps been lost is the particular intimacy of instruction, the sense of being in a room with another person who does this particular thing and is willing to show you how, who will stop and correct the angle of your finger and tell you yes, like that. Now hold it there. The knowledge survives. The room it was learned in does not. There is also the question of what the victory roll meant then versus what it means now, and whether that meaning can be fully separated from the context that produced it. When women in the 1940s rolled their hair into those distinctive cylinders above their temples, they were operating within a specific matrix of cultural pressures and permissions. The wartime demand for feminine resilience, the beauty industry's insistence that glamour was a patriotic act, the genuine desire of women to maintain a relationship with their own appearance as a form of selfhood that the emergency could not entirely subsume. The women who wear the victory roll today are typically doing something different. They're engaging with history, performing nostalgia, participating in a subculture devoted to mid-century aesthetic codes, or simply finding that the style suits their face and their wardrobe. Neither motivation is more legitimate than the other. The style does not require the original context to function as a style. It functions through its visual properties, its geometry, its relationship to the features of the face it frames and lifts. But understanding the original context gives the contemporary practitioner something additional, a sense of what the style was for, what it accomplished, what it cost the women who wore it, not in time and products, but in the complex economy of personal expression under social pressure. The victory roll was beautiful. It was also a solution to a problem that no longer exists in the same form. To wear it now is to carry that solution into a present where the problem has changed beyond recognition, and to wear it anyway, because the solution was elegant and the elegance has not expired. The beauty supply industry's response to the victory roll's revival in contemporary vintage communities offers a small window into how historical techniques are preserved and transmitted in a commercial age. Several companies now market bobby pins explicitly designed to replicate the period-accurate finish of the original style. longer than the standard modern pin, with a matte black lacquer finish that matches the archival photographs more closely than modern chrome pins do. Setting lotions have been reformulated to use the same quince seed and flaxseed gel bases that 1940s products used, marketed to vintage enthusiasts who want period-accurate materials as well as period-accurate results. This micro-market for historical accuracy is narrow but devoted, and it represents something interesting. A community that has decided to pursue not merely the aesthetic of a past era, but the specific material culture through which that aesthetic was originally achieved. To do the victory roll with the right products in the right order using the right technique is, in this community's understanding, to do something qualitatively different from doing it approximately or with substitutions. The difference is historical fidelity. Whether historical fidelity changes the final result significantly is a question that devotees answer with a certainty that practitioners working in modern materials do not always share. The argument is not really about the hair. It never quite is. There is a moment in the 1951 film An American in Paris when the camera holds on Leslie Caron for just long enough to register the extraordinary arrangement of curls sitting close and tight against her skull, each one a perfect small circle, the whole effect suggesting something between a sculpted marble bust and a freshly groomed standard poodle. Caron did not invent the style. She did not even popularize it in the way that is usually meant, the way a Hollywood leading lady consciously deploys a look and watches it migrate from fan magazines into Main Street beauty salons. She simply wore it, and the camera noticed, and the women who watched her noticed the camera noticing. By the following spring, beauty salons across the United States were fielding a request that stylists would spend the better part of a decade fulfilling. Make me look like that. The poodle cut arrived in a specific cultural moment that understood curls as optimism made physical. The previous decade had been one of restraint, in fabric, in gesture, in the very shapes women were permitted to occupy in public space. The post-war release valve expressed itself in Dior's enormous skirts, in the exuberant print patterns of domestic textiles, and in hair. The poodle cut, with its dense, joyful field of small, tight curls covering the entire head, was hair that took up space without apology. It was round where the wartime styles had been angular. It was abundant where the victory roll had been disciplined. It said, in the unspoken language of personal presentation, that the emergency was over and that frivolity had been rehabilitated. The technical foundation of the style was the permanent wave, a chemical process that American women had been embracing in various forms since the 1920s, but that had improved dramatically in the intervening decades. The cold wave, which arrived commercially in the late 1940s, used chemical reducing agents rather than heat to reshape the hair's protein structure, wrapping sections around small rods and allowing a neutralizing solution to set the new curl pattern in place. The results were more predictable than heat permanents and considerably less likely to produce the frizzed, uneven texture that had given earlier methods a somewhat uncertain reputation. By 1950, the cold wave had become the dominant permanent technique in American salons, and the small rod size required to produce the tight curl of the poodle cut was available in nearly every professional supply catalogue. The cut itself was almost as important as the texture. The poodle cut was short, cropped close to the neck with no length to speak of below the ears, and this was the element that made some women hesitate before requesting it. Short hair in the post-war years carried complicated associations. The very short cuts worn by some women in Europe after the liberation had been read, in ways that were not always comfortable to examine, as either a political statement or a mark of previous suffering. The poodle cut navigated this tension by being short in length, but voluminous in texture, so that the visual impression was one of abundant femininity rather than austerity. The curls provided the softness that the cut's brevity might otherwise have sacrificed. Stylists of the period describe the cutting technique in trade journals with a specificity that is almost athletic. After the permanent wave was completed and the hair was dry, the stylist would work section by section with small scissors, never shears which would cut too bluntly through the curl structure, snipping each individual curl to a length of approximately 3/4 of an inch from the scalp. The curls, once cut, would spring back slightly, shortening themselves further, and the stylist needed to account for this elasticity, leaving each section fractionally longer than the desired finished length. A novice who cut too close produced a result that was more military than fashionable, and the distinction mattered enormously to clients who were paying for a specific social grammar to sit on top of their heads. Maintenance between salon visits was an exercise in controlled touch. Too much combing destroyed the curl definition, separating the individual ringlets into a generalized frizz that bore no resemblance to the original style. Too little handling produced what stylists called flatting, areas where the curls had been pressed by sleep into a shape that was neither tight nor wave, but something vaguely disappointing in between. Women who wore the style successfully developed a vocabulary of gesture, using only their fingertips to separate and lift individual curls, working with a light touch that respected the integrity of the chemical curl while refreshing its visible shape. Some used a pick comb, a long-handled tool with widely spaced teeth designed for exactly this purpose, to lift and aerate the overall mass without disturbing the individual ringlets. Products were essential and numerous. The post-war beauty industry understood the poodle cut client as a woman with a particular set of maintenance needs and moved promptly to supply them. Curl creams, formulated with light oils and setting agents, appeared in drugstore displays with packaging that promised the kind of disciplined shine visible in salon photographs. Toni Home Permanent, one of the most successful consumer permanent wave kits of the era, ran advertisements depicting women in poodle cuts with taglines that emphasized the ease and economy of achieving the look without a salon visit. The Home Permanent wave kit was, in the context of the early 1950s, a democratizing technology. It brought to women in rural areas and smaller cities the textural vocabulary that had previously required access to a well-equipped urban salon. The name, when it came, was slightly mischievous. It emerged from a general public that observed the similarity between the cut's tight curls and the groomed coat of the standard poodle, which was itself undergoing a remarkable cultural moment in the early 50s, appearing on ceramic figurines, on novelty jewellery, on the famous felt skirts that teenagers wore to school dances. The poodle was a symbol of a very specific kind of mid-century aspiration, French-inflected, slightly sophisticated, cheerful without being naive. To name a haircut after it was to accept and amplify this symbolism, to wear one's hair as a declaration of aesthetic allegiance. By 1955, the poodle cut was beginning to compete with the Italian boy, a slightly longer, more loosely waved style that offered similar brevity without the tight curl architecture. The two styles existed in the same cultural space for several years, worn by different women who saw in each cut a slightly different version of the same aspiration. The aspiration to look modern, to look effortless, to look as though one had arrived at one's appearance without excessive labour. The labour was, of course, enormous. It always is. The particular genius of the poodle cut was that it made enormous labour look like pure personality, like something that simply grew that way, like a woman who had been curly her entire life and had simply decided to stop apologizing for it. The geography of the poodle cut's adoption tells an interesting story about how hairstyles move through post-war American culture. The style reached major urban centers first, arriving in New York and Chicago salons within weeks of its film appearances, and worked outward from there through the networks of fashion coverage, trade journal distribution, and the simple social mechanism of one woman seeing another woman's hair and deciding she wanted the same thing. Small-town adoption lagged the urban wave by approximately 6 to 12 months, which was the typical gap in the early 1950s for any style that required specialized technical skills. The time it took for training to diffuse from urban beauty schools outward into smaller markets, and for salon clients to see enough examples of the finished style to feel confident requesting it. The Home Permanent Wave kit, marketed aggressively throughout this period, complicated the geography somewhat. Toni, Lilt, and Pinnit, Home Permanent systems were sold through drugstores and grocery stores with a national distribution network that made them available simultaneously in markets of every size. The instructions included in these kits were written for the general consumer rather than the trained stylist, which meant they prioritized simplicity over precision. A woman using a Home Permanent kit to achieve the poodle cut worked with smaller rods than the kit typically provided in its standard configuration, often purchasing supplemental rods from beauty supply stores to get the tight curl size the style required. The results were variable in ways that salon permanents were not, but they were available to women for whom a salon was geographically or economically inaccessible, and that availability had its own form of cultural significance. The emotional relationship that women of the period described with the poodle cut was one of the more interesting aspects of its social history. Unlike the structured updos that defined formal and evening occasions, the poodle cut was a permanent alteration to the character of a woman's hair, not something put on in the morning and taken down at night, but a fundamentally different texture and length that she would inhabit continuously for the months until it grew out. Women who made the change often described a period of adjustment, not dissatisfaction, but recalibration, a process of learning how to be a person with different hair than the person they'd previously been. The hair they saw in the mirror in the morning for the first few weeks was unfamiliar. The woman it framed was being reconstructed, very slightly but very genuinely, through the sheer accumulation of seeing herself differently. This reconstructive possibility, the idea that a change in hairstyle produces a change in self-perception that produces eventually a change in self, was something that the beauty industry of the period both understood and deliberately cultivated. Advertisements for Home Permanent systems invariably depicted the before and after as an emotional transformation rather than merely a cosmetic one. The before woman was tired, overlooked, a little dulled by routine. The after woman, in her poodle cut, was animated, noticed, the subject of attention from the people around her. The product was selling not merely curls but the experience of being made visible, of moving from the background of one's own life to its foreground, which was a need that the mid-century domestic ideal both created and suppressed in complex mutually reinforcing ways. The poodle cut's decline was as swift as its arrival. By 1958, the bouffant was dominating the covers of beauty magazines, and the tight curl of the poodle cut sat awkwardly against the smooth, expansive surfaces that the newer style required. Clients who had worn the poodle cut for 2 or 3 years grew their hair out, or had the curls chemically relaxed, or waited for the permanent wave to grow to a length at which it could be set and styled in the bouffant manner. Hairdressers, for their part, welcomed the shift. The Bouffant was technically interesting and offered more visible drama than the relatively contained poodle cut. The transition was managed in most salons with the practical efficiency of a wardrobe change. Yesterday's style completed its run, today's style took the stage. The poodle cut's decade in the spotlight was over. But it had settled something important about what American women were permitted to want from their hair: volume, texture, personality, a visual presence that was unapologetically joyful. Whatever came after the poodle cut was building on the ground it had cleared. One final dimension of the poodle cut that deserves acknowledgement is the degree to which it served as a kind of cultural bridge between the hairline of wartime practicality and the elaborate bouffant constructions that would define the later part of the decade. The poodle cut was short like a wartime crop, but it was densely textured and visually rich in a way that the purely functional wartime cuts were not. It occupied an in-between position, claiming the practical advantages of brevity while emphatically rejecting the austerity that brevity had previously implied. In this sense, it was a transitional style in the fullest meaning of the term, not merely a style that appeared between two other styles chronologically, but a style that actively performed the transition, that wore the post-war release from wartime constraint on its permanently curled and jubilantly rounded surface. It was the hairstyle that told you the emergency was over and the celebration had begun, in the same breath, in the same exuberant cluster of tight springing curls. Somewhere in the American Midwest in 1958, a housewife named Eleanor Pritchard, her real name preserved in a local newspaper's society column, arrived at her neighbour's dinner party with her hair so architecturally elevated that the hostess, flustered, was heard to say that Eleanor appeared to have grown 6 inches since Tuesday. This was not, strictly speaking, accurate. Eleanor Pritchard had grown nothing. What she had done, over the course of approximately 90 minutes that afternoon, with a rat-tail comb, a can of Aquanet Extra Hold, and the particular focused determination of a woman who had seen something in a magazine and decided it would be hers, was construct a bouffant. The height was real. The elevation was achieved. The hair had not grown. It had been engineered. The bouffant, the word is French, from bouffer, meaning to puff or swell, arrived in American consciousness through 2 channels that converged with unusual precision in the late 1950s. The first was haute couture, specifically the influence of Parisian houses whose silhouettes for the new decade emphasized roundness and volume at both the hem and the crown. If a dress skirt was going to sweep out dramatically from a nipped waist, then the head required a corresponding visual mass, a counterweight that kept the total composition from appearing top-heavy in the wrong direction. The bouffant solved this architectural equation with elegant efficiency. The second channel was television, specifically the rapidly expanding roster of variety programs, quiz shows and dramatic anthologies that brought performed femininity into living rooms every evening. The women on screen, the singers, the actresses, the wives in television dramas, had hair that needed to read at a distance, that needed to maintain its shape under studio lights and through the movements of performance. The bouffant held, the bouffant telegraphed. The technique required a tool that would become as iconic as the style itself, the rat-tail comb. This instrument, with its fine-toothed wide end and its long, slender pointed handle, served 2 functions that were essential to the bouffant's construction. The teeth were used for sectioning and smoothing the outer surface of the style, giving it the polished finish that distinguished a professional result from an amateur one. The handle was used for back combing, the decisive, somewhat violent-sounding process of pushing the hair shaft backward toward the scalp to create a dense, matted internal scaffolding that would support the outer layers in their elevated position. Back combing also called teasing or ratting depending on the regional idiom, was the structural secret that no amount of spraying alone could replicate. Without a properly back-combed interior, a bouffant was merely sprayed hair. With it, the style had bones. The process began at the crown. A section of hair approximately 3 inches wide was clipped out of the way while the stylist or the woman herself worked the sections below, back-combing each one in firm, short strokes from the mid-shaft toward the root, accumulating a nest of compressed hair that gradually built upward from the scalp. This material was then smoothed over on the surface with the wide end of the comb or with a soft natural bristle brush, worked very gently so as not to disturb the tangle underneath, while creating the clean, rounded exterior silhouette that photographs so luxuriously. The crown section was released last, swept backward and over the structure, and pressed into place. Then came the spray. Aqua Net, which had been introduced in 1955, became the standard reference product of the Bouffant era, with the quiet dominance of a product that simply does its job without drama. The aerosol hairspray market was young. The first consumer aerosol hairspray had appeared only in 1948, developed by a chemist at the Midwest Research Institute named Robert Abplanalp, whose contribution to mid-century femininity is almost entirely absent from the historical record but was, in practical terms, enormous. Aquanet's formula used a shellac-based lacquer suspended in alcohol, delivered as a fine mist that dried quickly and set the hair in whatever configuration it occupied at the moment of application. For a bouffant, this meant the spray was applied in thin, even coats from a distance of approximately 8 to 10 inches, allowing the lacquer to settle uniformly across the outer surface without creating visible wet patches or stiff concentrations. Multiple light coats produced better results than a single heavy one, and experienced users developed an almost instinctive rhythm of spray and wait that became as automatic as any other step in the morning routine. The bouffant was not, contrary to a persistent nostalgic simplification, a single style. It existed on a spectrum of volume that ranged from the modest, gently lifted crown of a suburban housewife on a Tuesday morning to the monumental constructions that appeared on the heads of beehive practitioners, a related but distinct style that pushed the vertical ambition of back-combing to its logical extreme and then several inches beyond. The true bouffant occupied the middle register of this spectrum, full enough to be unmistakably intentional, restrained enough to pass through a doorway without incident. It was the height of the everyday, the spectacular made domestic. Sleeping in a bouffant was, by all accounts, an exercise in strategic acceptance. The style was too large and too fragile to survive overnight contact with a pillow, and the standard solution was the sleeping net, a fine mesh cap available at any drugstore in colours designed to be invisible under daylight, which was placed over the entire structure before bed and removed the following morning. In theory, the backcombing and spray held the shape intact through the night, and a minor restorative touch with the comb and a brief additional spraying restored the style to presentability. In practice, this worked approximately as often as household theory ever does, which is to say sometimes perfectly and sometimes not at all. Women who wore the bouffant seriously kept a spray can on the bedside table. The social reach of the bouffant extended far beyond its Parisian theoretical origins. By 1962, when Jackie Kennedy wore a modified version of the style, more controlled, more quietly architectural, styled by Kenneth Patel at his East 65th Street salon in New York, it acquired a layer of aspirational association that secured its dominance for the remainder of the decade. Kennedy's bouffant was restrained by the standards of its time, not towering, not lacquered to the point of rigidity, but undeniably present, undeniably shaped. It communicated a kind of seriousness that the more exuberant versions of the style did not quite achieve. Women's magazines immediately produced analysis of the First Lady's hair that was more detailed than most coverage of foreign policy, and salons reported a surge in requests for what customers called simply the Jackie, a designator that Kenneth, who became the most photographed hairdresser in America during those years, reportedly found both gratifying and slightly exhausting. The bouffant's decline, when it came, arrived not from fashion but from physics. The cultural upheaval of the mid-1960s, with its valorization of straight, long, natural hair as a political and generational statement, made the architectural complexity of the bouffant read as exactly what it was: a construction, a performance, a product of effort and convention. Young women who stopped back-combing their hair were not simply choosing a different aesthetic. They were rejecting a particular relationship between femininity and labor, between appearance and maintenance, between the self and its daily manufacture. The bouffant did not die so much as it was consciously set down, left on a vanity table beside the aquanet and the rat-tail comb, while the culture walked into a room where the rules were different. Eleanor Pritchard at her neighbour's dinner party would not have recognised what came next as hair at all. The aerosol industry that supplied the bouffant's essential product underwent its own transformation during the style's dominance. Between 1958 and 1965, the years of the bouffant's peak influence, American manufacturers produced and sold hairspray in quantities that no one in 1948, when the first consumer aerosol hairspray appeared, would have been able to imagine. The aerosol can itself was a post-war technological artifact, developed for insecticide distribution during the Second World War, and redirected to consumer beauty applications in the immediate post-war years with the cheerful pragmatism of an industry that had spent 4 years making anything the government needed, and was now eager to make anything the consumer would buy. Aerosol technology made the bouffant possible in its most extreme forms by providing a delivery mechanism that could deposit a uniform, fine coat of lacquer across a three-dimensional surface, the irregular terrain of a large sculptured hairstyle, in a way that no brush or comb application could replicate. The environmental consequences of this aerosol usage were not understood at the time, and would not become a subject of public discussion until the 1970s, when research on chlorofluorocarbon propellants and their relationship to atmospheric ozone became a matter of regulatory concern. The women applying aquanet to their bouffants in 1962 were operating in a period when the can of hairspray on the bathroom shelf was regarded as purely and straightforwardly a tool, as neutral in its environmental implications as the rat-tail comb beside it. This is worth noting not as a retrospective judgment, but as a context. The bouffant era was one of those moments when a new technology had been adopted at scale before its costs were visible, which was a pattern that the post-war consumer economy would repeat in several other domains before the century ended. The social geography of the bouffant within women's communities was as structured as any other form of social distinction. Within a given suburb or neighbourhood, the height and elaboration of a woman's bouffant communicated something about her relationship to the dominant aesthetic, how closely she was following fashion, how much time and money she was investing in her appearance, how seriously she took the competitive dimension of female personal presentation that mid-century social culture maintained through a system of mutual observation that was rarely explicit and almost never acknowledged. A woman who wore a modest, sensibly proportioned bouffant was playing by the rules. A woman who wore an extravagant version was either marking a special occasion or making a statement about her priorities and her confidence. A woman who arrived at church or at the PTA meeting in a flat, unset hairstyle was sending a message that the community decoded quickly and without particular charity. The end of the bouffant was not an aesthetic failure, but a cultural displacement. When the youth counterculture of the mid-1960s proposed that natural, straight or loosely wavy hair was the authentic expression of an authentic self, the bouffant became associated with the values that the counterculture was rejecting, with conformity, with artifice, with a particular construction of femininity as performance and decoration. This association was not entirely fair to the bouffant, which had been, in its origins and its social function, as much about pragmatic community membership as about the suppression of authentic selfhood. But cultural transitions rarely pause for nuanced assessment. The bouffant was the opposite of what the next era wanted, and so it became, in the cultural memory of the 1960s, a symbol of everything the decade believed it was moving away from. Whether it actually was that symbol, or whether it was simply a hairstyle that a lot of women wore while they went about the complicated business of being human, is a question that nostalgia and cultural criticism have answered differently, and probably will continue to. There is a photograph that appears in several published histories of American fashion. Its specific provenance varies depending on the publication, showing a woman standing in a suburban kitchen in what appears to be approximately 1961, wearing a house dress and holding a mixing bowl. Her bouffant so large and so perfectly cylindrical that it occupies nearly as much vertical space as her face and neck combined. The photograph is usually reproduced to produce a knowing smile, a gentle nostalgia for the apparent absurdity of the era's beauty standards, the good humour of looking back at what people thought was normal. What the photograph actually documents, if you look at it without the irony, is a technical achievement of considerable sophistication. A woman who understood the physics of her own hair well enough to have constructed and maintained, in a domestic setting without professional assistance, a structure that required precise knowledge of setting, back combing, and spray application to execute at all. The smile it produces is not wrong, but it is incomplete. In August of 1957, Audrey Hepburn arrived at the Venice Film Festival wearing a dress by Givenchy, and her hair arranged in the style that would spend the next several decades being described in beauty publications ranging from Vogue to the pamphlets distributed at cosmetology school graduations as the most eternally elegant updo in the history of Western personal presentation. The twist itself, the smooth vertical roll of hair ascending along the back of the head, its edge tucked under rather than over, the whole thing pinned with surgical discretion, so that not a single metal implement was visible from the front, was not Hepburn's invention. Versions of it appear in fashion illustrations from the late 19th century, and the general structure of a vertically rolled updo has antecedents scattered across centuries of European court fashion. But Hepburn wore it at a particular moment, in a particular cultural context, in photographs that were subsequently reproduced so many times that the style and the image became inseparable, and in that fusion of person and hairstyle something permanent happened. The French twist became the answer to a question that women would keep asking: what do you do with your hair when the occasion is serious? The construction of a proper French twist is one of those techniques that looks, from a distance, as though it requires either professional training or supernatural aptitude, and that reveals itself upon closer examination to be the product of a very specific and learnable sequence of steps that need only be practiced enough times to become reflexive. The sequence is this. All the hair is gathered at the nape, held in the left hand as though preparing for a low ponytail, and then twisted clockwise until the entire gathered mass has wound itself into a vertical rope that runs up the centre of the back of the head. This twisted rope is then folded inward and up, tucking its end beneath itself, creating the characteristic smooth roll that ascends toward the crown. The critical moment is the final fold. Whether the edge of the roll faces right or left was a matter of regional and personal convention, but most stylists of the period preferred the tuck to face right, which they considered more geometrically resolved. The whole structure was then secured with hairpins, long straight pins, not bobby pins, which were considered too casually modern for the formality the style implied. The texture of the hair mattered more for the French twist than for almost any other style of the decade. The smooth roll required smooth hair, and the post-war cosmetic industry had developed a robust arsenal of products designed to achieve exactly this. Brilliantines, which were oil-based preparations pressed between the palms and smoothed over the hair shaft, had been in use since the early 20th century, but by the 1950s they had been joined by water-based setting lotions, light pomades with botanical oil bases, and a new category of product called hairdress, which combined light conditioning agents with enough hold to subdue flyaways without creating the heavy, wet-looking surface that heavier products produced. The French twist demanded a hair surface that reflected light evenly, without the texture breaks that indicated a struggle had taken place in its making. The goal was effortlessness achieved through considerable effort, which is perhaps the most precise description of mid-century elegance as a general project. Accessories played a role that was grammatically precise. A barrette placed at the base of the twist was acceptable if it was tortoiseshell or gold and not too large. A spray of small pearl-headed pins distributed along the fold's edge was considered appropriate for evening occasions of moderate formality. A small hat, the kind of architectural confection that milliners of the period called a fascinator, a tilted disc or a shallow-brimmed pillbox, could be anchored into the mass of the twist itself without disturbing the style, which was one of the practical advantages of an updo in an era when hat-wearing remained a social expectation at certain events. The hat slid onto the hairstyle like a key into a lock. The twist, with its compact mass and its internal armature of pins, was one of the few hairstyles that held a hat without complaint. What the French twist communicated socially was a vocabulary that the 1950s had inherited from centuries of European court culture and then updated for the suburban American context. It said, specifically, "I have taken this seriously." It said, "I understand that occasions have requirements." It said, without a trace of apology, that the wearer was not merely attending the event in question, but was presenting herself at it, offering a version of herself that had been considered, constructed, and refined before arrival. In a decade that placed enormous cultural weight on the concept of the well-put-together woman, a concept that appeared in magazine editorials, in etiquette books, in the advice columns that every major newspaper ran for female readers, the French twist was the hairstyle that embodied the concept most completely. Other styles were pretty, or modern, or practical. The French twist was correct. The women who wore it most fluently were not necessarily those with the most hair or the thickest strands. Thin hair, well managed and properly conditioned, could produce a French twist of great delicacy that many stylists preferred to the heavier version. The challenge with fine hair was achieving the smooth, polished surface without the structure collapsing from insufficient mass, and stylists addressed this through the strategic use of a product then called setting spray, a lighter formulation than the lacquers used for bouffants, designed to add body without stiffness. Applied to slightly damp hair before styling, the setting spray dried as the style was constructed, contributing to the integrity of the finished structure in the same way that starch contributed to the integrity of a linen tablecloth, invisibly, thoroughly, from the inside out. Men of the period often confessed ignorance of what exactly their wives and colleagues had done to their hair on a given occasion, able to register only that the result looked particularly composed. This was precisely the intended effect. The French twist was designed to be legible as elegance to observers who could not articulate its technical components, to communicate at the level of impression rather than analysis. A woman walking into a room wearing a well-executed French twist produced, in those who encountered her, a subliminal registration of competence and poise that preceded any assessment of the individual features of her appearance. The hairstyle was, in this sense, a form of rhetoric, an argument made through aesthetic means, arriving before its maker had spoken a word. The lasting cultural power of the French twist is perhaps most visible in the context where it continues to be chosen today. Diplomatic functions, significant professional presentations, formal ceremonies where the balance between authority and femininity must be calibrated with particular care. These remain the occasions where the style reappears, usually on women who may not be able to articulate why they have chosen it, who might describe their choice in terms as simple as it seemed right or it felt appropriate. What they are responding to, without necessarily knowing it, is 7 decades of accumulated cultural meaning, all the occasions on which women before them chose this specific geometry to convey this specific message, all the Venice film festivals and state dinners and board meetings where someone walked into a room with her hair twisted vertically against the back of her head and was, in some fundamental way, taken at her word. The grammar of elegance does not require translation. It is either spoken or it is not, and when it is spoken correctly, the room knows. The teaching of the French twist passed through 2 distinct channels in the 1950s, channels that occasionally intersected but more often ran parallel to each other without quite meeting. The first was the professional beauty school curriculum, where the twist appeared as an advanced styling technique, taught after the student had mastered the foundational skills of pin curl setting and roller setting, and had developed enough manual dexterity with bobby pins to handle the demands of an updo requiring precise placement. Students in these programs learned the twist on mannequin heads first, where the absence of a living, reactive scalp allowed them to practice the gather and twist and pin sequence without the additional complexity of a client who shifted in the chair and had opinions about the result. The second channel was the domestic one, the informal transmission of styling knowledge that happened between women who saw a result they admired and sought to replicate it. In this channel, the French twist was learned from a friend, a mother, a neighbour, a magazine tutorial with clear enough photographs and detailed enough instructions that a motivated woman could work through them at home with a hand mirror propped on the bathroom shelf. The home-learned French twist was sometimes perfect and sometimes approximate, the technique adapted to whatever tools were on hand and whatever manual skills the individual practitioner possessed. The key insight that most domestic learners arrived at through trial and error, that the success of the twist depended on the initial gather, that hair insufficiently gathered at the nape would not produce a clean roll above it, was the same insight that beauty school students received in explicit instruction. The knowledge was the same, the path to it differed. products specifically marketed for updo styling occupied an interesting position in the mid-century beauty product landscape. They were not mass-market items in the way that shampoo or hairspray were. Not every woman would need them, since not every woman wore updos regularly. But they were sufficiently in demand that major beauty companies produced them and distributed them through the same drugstore and department store channels that carried their more broadly used products. A light setting spray sold under names like Stiff Stuff or Firm Hold competed for shelf space with the general use hairsprays, differentiated by their formulation for the specific needs of pinned, gathered, or twisted styles. The distinction mattered to practitioners who had learned through experience that a general-purpose lacquer, applied to an updo, could leave the surface too stiff to accept the final smoothing that the style required. The French twist's most interesting social function in the 1950s may have been its role as a marker of occasion and intentionality. Unlike the standing styles of the era, the bouffant, the page boy, the various set and sprayed configurations that women wore through their daily routines, the French twist was typically chosen for events that warranted a departure from the ordinary. The graduation ceremony, the formal dinner, the wedding reception, the job interview at a company where one very much wanted to be taken seriously. These were the occasions that sent women to the mirror to practice the gather and the twist and the pin, or to the salon to have Kenneth or his less celebrated colleagues on the West Side execute it on their behalf. The style was a declaration of occasion, which meant that its appearance on a woman's head communicated to everyone who saw her that she had decided this particular gathering was worth the effort. In a social culture that passed effort carefully, too little suggesting indifference, too much suggesting insecurity, the French twist occupied exactly the right register of dignified intentionality. This is perhaps why the style has remained durable through every subsequent decade's fashion upheaval, surviving the naturalism of the 60s, the theatrical excess of the 70s, the padded shoulders and crimped hair of the 80s, and the studied casualness of the 90s without fundamentally changing or losing its cultural meaning. It is one of the few hairstyles that has maintained a stable semantic identity across 6 decades of otherwise relentless stylistic transformation. When a contemporary woman chooses the French twist for a formal occasion, she is drawing on exactly the same social grammar that a woman in 1957 drew on when she made the same choice. The hairpins are different. The setting spray is different. The message is identical. In the autumn of 1949, Helena Rubinstein published a book called My Life for Beauty, in which she described the ideal feminine silhouette for the coming decade with the authoritative brevity of someone who'd been telling women what to do with themselves for 40 years and saw no reason to soften her convictions. The face, she wrote, should be framed, not merely accompanied by hair but actually framed, the way a painting is framed, with the borders of the hairstyle directing attention inward toward the features rather than outward toward the surrounding space. What she was describing, without naming it directly, was the page boy, a style that had been circulating in various forms since the medieval imagery that had given it its name, but that arrived in the post-war American context with a freshness that made it feel newly invented. The clean, blunt-cut ends, the slight inward curl at the tips, the smooth fall of hair from a centre or side part to a length just at or slightly below the jaw. Helena Rubinstein was not wrong that it framed the face. She was, however, understating the case. The page boy did not merely frame the face, it delivered it, as on a plate. The page boy's essential characteristic, the defining feature that distinguished it from the looser, more romantically undisciplined bobs that had preceded it, was the terminal curl. The hair fell straight, or very nearly straight, from the part to the ends, and then, at the very last inch, turned under, not flipped, not the upward curve of what would later be called the flip, which would dominate the early 1960s, but under, rolling inward toward the neck in a gentle, controlled C-curve that gave the bottom edge of the style its characteristic smooth finish. This terminal curl was achieved through setting, either on rollers while the hair was damp, or with a curling iron applied to the dry ends after the rest of the style was in place. Stylists of the period debated the two methods with the kind of technical passion that their descendants would reserve for arguments about Brazilian blowouts. The roller method produced a more consistent, evenly distributed curl. The iron method allowed for quick touch-ups between salon visits. The length was as important as the terminal curl, and the conventions governing it were more precise than they might appear. A page boy that fell to the chin was a different social statement from one that fell to the jaw, and one that reached the collarbone spoke yet another dialect of the same visual language. Chin length was considered the most youthful version of the style, appropriate for younger women and for daytime occasions that required a certain lightness. Jaw length was the standard, the default, the version that appeared in fashion photographs and department store advertisements, and on the heads of the women who populated the middle registers of social ambition. Not debutantes, not factory workers, but the women who belonged to the junior league and taught piano lessons and attended PTA meetings, and whose appearance was expected to communicate reliable good taste without calling undue attention to itself. Collarbone length was the most sophisticated iteration, suggesting a woman who had made a considered aesthetic choice rather than simply defaulting to social convention. The maintenance demands of the page boy were considerable but regular, which suited a decade that valued routine. Because the style depended on its clean, blunt bottom edge for much of its visual effect, the ends needed to be trimmed every 6 to 8 weeks to prevent the kind of progressive irregularity that accumulated when hair was allowed to grow unevenly. A page boy that had not been trimmed on schedule began to develop an undisciplined fringe at the bottom, a suggestion of surrender that was antithetical to the style's entire grammar. The trim was not a luxury, it was structural maintenance, as necessary as oiling a hinge or tightening a loose cabinet door. Women who understood this kept their salon appointments with a consistency that their hairdressers found gratifying. Women who did not understand it eventually arrived at their appointments apologetically, with hair that had begun to lose the argument. Setting the style at home required a specific combination of tools that had become standard equipment in the mid-century bathroom. Rollers, the pink plastic or metal mesh variety that came in graduated sizes, the largest producing the least curl, the smallest the most, were the primary instrument. For a page boy, the relevant size was large, positioned at the ends of the hair and rolled under rather than up, which set the direction of the terminal curl while the hair dried. Drying time under a hooded dryer was approximately 30 to 45 minutes for hair of average thickness, and the hooded home hair dryer, which had been available as a consumer product since the late 1940s and which had by the mid-50s descended from luxury item to common appliance, made this process considerably less time-consuming than air drying. The result, when the rollers were removed and the hair combed smooth, was the polished, even fall of hair that the style required, with the ends lying obediently inward. The cultural politics of the page boy were interestingly ambiguous in ways that contemporary observers noted without fully resolving. On one hand, it was an enormously practical style, easy to maintain between salon visits, tolerant of the conditions imposed by a working woman's day, appropriate across a wider range of social contexts than the more elaborate constructions of the era. A woman in a page boy could move from a morning grocery run to a luncheon to an afternoon at the school to an early dinner without her hair requiring intervention at any stage. This versatility was celebrated in the women's magazines of the period as a specifically modern virtue. Harper's Bazaar ran a feature in 1953 titled simply "The Most Useful Haircut in America," which was in fact about the page boy, and the word useful was used with genuine enthusiasm rather than as a concession to practicality. On the other hand, the page boy's smooth, controlled, impeccably maintained surface was read by some cultural critics as an expression of exactly the kind of well-behaved femininity that the following decade would begin to interrogate. The style made no mess. It offered no surprises. It arrived and departed the same way it had entered, without loosening, without breaking free of its setting, without the romantic disorder that an earlier era had associated with passionate femininity and that the 1960s would reclaim with considerable energy. To wear a page boy was to be, in a very specific visual sense, in control of yourself, which was simultaneously a statement of discipline and a kind of performance of constraint. The page boy's most interesting legacy may be its persistence. Unlike the victory roll, which carries explicit historical association, or the bouffant, which reads immediately as a period style, the page boy has never entirely left the cultural stage. It appears and disappears in fashion cycles but never vanishes entirely, and the reason is probably the one Helena Rubinstein identified in 1949. It frames the face. Not every style does. Many hairstyles orbit around the face, creating a context for it, a background against which it is perceived. The page boy frames it, directs attention toward it, insists on it as the primary visual subject. Women who understand that their faces are interesting tend to find their way to this style eventually. They may not know they are following Helena Rubinstein's prescription. The prescription doesn't require attribution to work. The social texture of the mid-century American beauty salon was the environment in which the page boy was most consistently experienced as a shared aesthetic culture rather than a private choice. The beauty parlour, a term still in wide use in the 1950s, before salon displaced it in common usage, was a distinctly gendered social space whose function went well beyond the styling services it provided. Women who came in every 6 to 8 weeks for their trim and their shampoo and set were participating in a social institution that served as a forum for community information, a space for relaxed conversation across the class gradations that more formal settings maintained more carefully, and a place where personal questions could be discussed with a frankness that few other mid-century social environments permitted. The hairdresser in this context was a figure of considerable social power, whose authority derived not from technical certification alone, but from the accumulated trust of sustained relationship. A woman who brought her hair to the same stylist for 5 or 10 years was bringing something more personal than her head. She was bringing her concerns about her appearance, her estimates of her own attractiveness, her complicated relationship with the idea of aging as it expressed itself through the changing texture and colour of her hair. The conversation that surrounded a page boy trim was therefore embedded in a much larger ongoing narrative, one that the stylist needed to be capable of holding alongside the more explicitly technical demands of her work. The question of colour in the page boy's cultural history is one that the style's photographic record somewhat obscures. The style appears in black and white photographs, which constitute the majority of the visual record from this period, as a purely tonal phenomenon, the darkness or lightness of the hair providing the value contrast that the smooth surface required to photograph well. But the actual colour of these page boys in 1953 or 1956 was a much more varied and sometimes more chemical affair than monochrome photography reveals. Salon tinting and rinsing services were in wide use throughout the decade, and the Clairol Corporation's introduction of single-step home hair colouring, with the launch of Miss Clairol in 1956, changed the relationship between women and hair colour as fundamentally as the cold wave had changed their relationship with curl. The page boy, with its smooth surface and clean edges, was an excellent showcase for hair colour. The flat, even fall of hair displayed colour with particular clarity, and the combination of a well-executed page boy and a carefully chosen tint produced a result that women's magazines covered extensively under the category of total grooming, which was the decade's term for the coordinated management of hair, skin, nail, and clothing as a unified aesthetic statement. The advertising language that surrounded the page boy throughout its period of dominance was notable for what it chose to emphasize and what it left unspoken. The words that appeared most frequently in magazine advertisements depicting the style were polished, sleek, smooth, clean, refined. These were aesthetic descriptors, but they were also character descriptors in the mid-century American cultural vocabulary, words that applied to behavior and social presentation as naturally as they applied to hair. A woman described as polished in 1954 was not merely a woman with well-maintained hair. She was a woman whose social performance across all dimensions had been brought to a consistent, deliberate, well-maintained standard. The page boy was the hairstyle that most perfectly embodied this aspiration, not because it was the most elaborate or the most technically demanding, but because it said quietly and clearly that this woman had understood the assignment. The page boy's relationship to professional aspiration in the 1950s deserves a brief separate consideration. Women entering or navigating professional environments during this decade faced a specific and difficult stylistic challenge: how to present themselves as competent and serious without visually departing so far from the era's feminine conventions as to invite the social penalties that attended such departures. The solution that many professional women arrived at intuitively, even when they could not have articulated the reasoning explicitly, was the page boy. It was short enough to suggest practicality and seriousness. It was sufficiently feminine in its terminal curl and its smooth surface to avoid the associations of masculine imitation that very short or very severe styles might attract. It was, in the language of mid-century social navigation, the right answer to an impossible question. The question was, how does a woman look like herself and like what the world wants from her simultaneously? The page boy said quietly, "You wear your hair like this, and you let the question answer itself." Margaret Vincy Helt, a hairdresser working at a salon in Elmhurst, Illinois in 1960, was reportedly asked by Modern Beauty Shop magazine to create a hairstyle that was new. Not updated, not revised, not a fresh interpretation of something that already existed. New. The request was the kind that usually produces something cautious and forgettable, the result of too much professional responsibility and not enough creative abandon. What Helt produced instead was the Beehive, a style of such architectural audacity that it required its own vocabulary of structural support, demanded a wholesale renegotiation of the relationship between a woman's height and the height of her hair, and then spent the better part of 3 years becoming one of the most recognized and one of the most misunderstood hairstyles in the history of American personal presentation. Helt later said she was inspired by the shape of a black fez she owned. The Beehive and the fez share a geometry. Both are cylinders, both are objects of disciplined verticality, both sit on top of a person, and announce that the person beneath them has made a decision. The structural engineering of the beehive was an extension and an intensification of the backcombing techniques that had produced the bouffant, but taken to a categorical extreme that produced something qualitatively different. Where the bouffant spread outward and upward in a rounded dome, the beehive rose almost straight up, its sides relatively vertical, its apex approximately oval in cross-section, its total height ranging from a modest 3 inches to the genuinely spectacular constructions of 8 or more inches that appeared on theatrical stages and in the more ambitious photograph spreads of fashion magazines. The internal structure required for this height was not merely back-combed hair, but a supplementary form, a wire frame, a foam cone, a roll of wadded netting, or in many documented cases, an actual metal frame sold by beauty supply companies specifically as a beehive form. This internal armature was placed on the head first, at the crown, and the hair was combed up and over it in sections, each section sprayed, smoothed, and pinned before the next was added, building the exterior of the cone layer by layer until the surface was smooth and the seams were invisible. The foam foundation that most professional stylists preferred was a conical piece of sponge approximately 4 to 6 inches tall, sold under various trade names, the most widely distributed of which was the beehive form, manufactured by a Chicago supply company that understood it had produced an industry product with the fortuitous timing of a company that has stumbled into exactly what the market is about to demand. The form was pinned to the hair at the crown using the same crossed bobby pin technique used for the victory roll, and the surrounding hair was then brushed upward over it in smooth sections, the natural fall of the hair resisting the direction of styling until spray and the repeated motion of the brush together overcame the resistance, and the hair lay flat against the foam surface, taking the cone's shape and holding it with the collective rigidity of multiple lacquer coats applied in rapid succession. The spray required for this operation was not ordinary hairspray applied at the ordinary rate. Beehive construction, as documented in salon training materials from the early 1960s, involved what stylists called layering, a systematic application of spray between each step of the construction, so that by the time the final surface was laid over the form, there were already several sealed layers beneath it, each one contributing to the overall structural integrity of the style. Some instructional pamphlets compared the effect to papier-mâché, which was both technically accurate and slightly alarming. The finished surface, when properly lacquered, was genuinely hard to the touch, not rigid in the way of a hat, but resistant in the way of something that has decided not to move and has the molecular structure to back up its decision. This hardness generated one of the beehive's most persistent cultural legends, the story of the vermin infestation, the tale which appears in virtually every popular history of the 1960s and has been repeated in newspaper features, television documentaries, and at least one academic paper on urban mythology, holds that women who wore their beehives for extended periods without washing them accumulated colonies of insects or rodents in the sealed interior. The story is, upon examination, almost certainly apocryphal. The lacquer coating would have been inhospitable to life, and the style's hard exterior would have discouraged the kind of penetration the story requires, but its persistence reveals something true about how the beehive was perceived. It was a style that people felt a need to explain, to account for, to find a natural consequence for, as though height itself required punishment. The mythology was the culture's way of managing the unsettledness that an extremely tall hairstyle produced in observers who could not quite articulate why they found it unsettling. What the beehive actually represented, stripped of legend and read in the context of its moment, was a working-class style that had been absorbed by mainstream fashion, and then, in one of those reversals that fashion executes with cheerful indifference to its own stated values, elevated by mainstream fashion into something temporarily glamorous before being descended back to its origins. The style's earliest adopters, before the magazine coverage and the salon tutorials and the ronettes, were hairdressers' clients in the mid-century American working class, women whose schedules did not accommodate frequent salon visits, and who needed a style that could be maintained once a week with a great deal of spray and minimal disturbance between appointments. The Beehive, with its sealed, spray-hardened exterior, was designed for this kind of durable, low-intervention maintenance. You set it at the beginning of the week, and you did not touch it until the following Thursday. This was not glamour as aspiration. It was glamour as efficiency. The ronettes arrived in 1963 wearing beehives of such commitment that the style was immediately redescribed in the music press as something theatrical, urban, and specific to the aesthetic culture of New York. Ronnie Spector's beehive was augmented with falls, hairpieces attached to the existing structure to add mass and height, and styled not over a foam form but through the combined application of extreme backcombing and industrial quantities of spray, producing a result that was denser and more deliberately dramatic than the salon version. The style on stage read at 20 feet with perfect clarity. It were a crown, a deliberate piece of personal theatre, the hairstyle as costume rather than grooming, and it was this theatrical version that entered cultural memory most durably, so that when people say Beehive today, they mean Ronnie Spector. They mean Amy Winehouse's deliberate resurrection of the style 40 years later. They mean the style at its most emphatic. They rarely mean Thursday morning in Elmhurst, Illinois, which is where it started. The Beehive's construction in a professional salon context required a set of environmental conditions that distinguished it from styles that could be executed quickly or casually. The time investment was significant. A full professional beehive, from the initial shampoo and conditioning treatment through the back combing, form placement, surface work, and final lacquering, required between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, depending on the height desired and the cooperation of the client's hair. This was not a style for women who came in for a quick wash and set. It was a style for women who had made an appointment in the morning and intended to arrive at their evening event looking spectacular, who understood that spectacular was the product of time, and who were willing to allocate that time to the production. The professional who executed the beehive with greatest consistency was, in most cases, not the generalist stylist who did a little of everything, but the specialist who had developed a particular affinity for architectural styling, and who had refined, through repetition, the specific techniques of backcombing and form placement that made the difference between a beehive that stood up through a 4-hour formal dinner and one that began to lean slightly to the left sometime around dessert. The leaning beehive was a social catastrophe that had to be managed with a combination of good humour, a borrowed compact mirror, and whatever bobby pins could be sourced from the handbags of sympathetic table mates. Experienced beehive wearers kept emergency pins tucked into evening bags as a matter of practical self-preservation. The social commentary that the beehive generated was, by the standards of a decade that was often highly prescriptive about appropriate feminine appearance, unusually explicit. Women who wore it received both unsolicited admiration and unsolicited critique in quantities that would have seemed excessive for most other hairstyle choices. The admiration generally took the form of questions about how the effect was achieved, which was a slightly disingenuous kind of compliment, a way of expressing appreciation while also expressing mild incredulity that such a thing was possible or desirable. The critique took forms that range from the politely reserved comment to the more direct observations of women who felt that the beehive represented a form of excess that reflected poorly on its wearer's judgment. What neither camp of respondents fully articulated was the degree to which the beehive was, for many of the women who wore it, simply fun. Not a statement, not a strategy, not a political act or a social commentary, but an experience of personal theatre that was available for a relatively modest investment of time and money, and that produced, for the duration of its wearing, a version of herself that the wearer found genuinely entertaining. To walk into a room wearing 8 inches of lacquered hair was to occupy a different register of visibility than walking in wearing a sensible page boy. The beehive made you a spectacle, in the original and not entirely pejorative sense of the word. Something to see, something that demanded to be noticed. There is a pleasure in this that the 1950s did not always give women many contexts to experience, and the beehive offered it reliably, dependably, with every can of Aquanet applied and every bobby pin crossed beneath the form. The contemporary revival of the beehive, which has appeared in fashion cycles with remarkable regularity since Amy Winehouse's adoption of the style in the early 2000s, operates from a cultural position that understands the style primarily through its most extreme and theatrical manifestations. The beehive of contemporary fashion is always the Renette's version, always the stage version, always a deliberate quotation from a specific period in popular music and visual culture that has been elevated to the status of iconic. What is largely absent from contemporary beehive discourse is the style's domestic history. All those Thursday morning salon appointments in Elmhurst and Dayton and Sacramento, all the women who wore a modest beehive on a Tuesday afternoon, not as a statement about anything in particular, but simply because they liked how it looked and because the spray held. That history is less glamorous than the mythology. It is also, in its particularity and its ordinariness, more interesting. There is one more dimension of the beehive that its critics and its nostalgists alike have tended to overlook, and that is its relationship to time, specifically to the question of whose time the style consumed and how that consumption was understood. A woman who maintained a beehive across a week between salon appointments was managing a complex ongoing domestic project. She was sleeping with the strategic care of someone preserving a museum exhibit. She was navigating environmental hazards, the low door frame, the automobile with a short headliner, the unexpected gust of wind in a parking lot, with a spatial awareness usually associated with people moving through spaces while carrying objects that extend significantly beyond their own bodies. She was, in other words, organising a portion of her daily life around the management of a hairstyle, and this organisation was so normalised within the culture's expectations of feminine grooming that it was not typically described as effort at all. It was described as looking good. The distinction between effort and appearance was one that the 1950s maintained with great consistency, and the beehive was one of the more spectacular examples of what that maintenance required. There is a category of historical photograph that appears infrequently in archival collections and almost never in fashion magazines. Images of women photographed not in the polished finality of a finished hairstyle, but in the earlier private stage of its construction, with their heads covered in the symmetrical grids of flat metal clips, the hair wound beneath each clip in a tight, flat coil, the overall effect suggesting a kind of deliberate, intimate disorder that the public face of mid-century femininity was designed to conceal. These photographs surface occasionally in collections of domestic photography from the 1940s and 50s, shot by amateur family photographers who either did not understand or did not care that they were documenting a private ritual. They are among the most honest records of mid-century women's relationship with their own appearance. More honest in some ways than the finished photographs in Vogue, because they show the labour that the Vogue photographs were constructed to erase. The pin curl was this labour made visible. It was the technique by which the smooth, soft, controlled waves and curls that defined mid-century hairstyling were actually produced. Not by sorcery, not by effortless natural texture, but by the systematic, patient wrapping of individual sections of damp hair around a finger, the flat coiling of each section against the scalp, and the securing of each coil with one or two flat metal clips, repeated across the entire head in a pattern that mapped the finished hairstyle in advance, like an architectural drawing made of hair and metal. A full pin curl set of the period might require 70 to 100 individual coils, each one the product of a specific technical decision: the diameter of the coil, the direction of the wind, the placement on the scalp, that determined the exact shape and direction of the resulting wave or curl when the hair was dry and the clips removed. The clips themselves, called bobby pins in some regional idioms and pin curl clips or finger wave clips in others, were a remarkably standardized piece of equipment whose ubiquity in mid-century domestic life is difficult to overstate. They were purchased by the card, typically 12 or 24 to a package, sold at drugstores and dime stores alongside the other infrastructure of feminine maintenance. The standard pin curl clip was approximately 2 inches long, with a flat crimped base that gripped the hair and held the coil flat against the scalp without leaving a mark, and a spring mechanism that, when the clip was squeezed open and then released, held the coil securely under the mechanical pressure of the spring. The clicking sound of a pin curl clip opening and closing was, for a generation of women and their families, as unremarkably domestic as the sound of a kitchen timer or a screen door. The setting pattern, the map of clips that covered the head during drying, was the element that required the most technical knowledge, and this knowledge was transmitted through a combination of beauty school training, magazine tutorials, and informal instruction passed between women in exactly the same way that cooking techniques were passed between women in the same era. Experientially, casually, often in kitchens or bathrooms, where one woman watched another perform a familiar skill and absorbed it through proximity rather than formal instruction. The magazines were helpful, but limited. A photograph in a beauty column could show the finished arrangement of clips on a head, could indicate the general direction of the winds, but could not transmit the particular pressure of the fingers, the angle at which the clip needed to be inserted to achieve a flat rather than a standing coil, the sense, developed through practice, of exactly how tight to wean the section before the curl would be too tight, exactly how loosely before it would be too loose. The relationship between the section size and the resulting curl size was the foundational principle of pin curl geometry, and it operated according to a rule that was simple to state and required extensive practice to master. Smaller coils produced tighter curls, larger coils produced looser waves, and the spacing between coils determined whether the finished style would show distinct, separated waves or a flowing, unified movement of the hair. A woman who wanted the very soft, wide waves that the 1950s associated with mature elegance needed large sections wound in large coils placed at intervals that allowed each wave to crest and fall in a long, gentle arc. A woman who wanted the tighter, more emphatic curls associated with the poodle cut or the ringlet-inflected styles of the mid-decade needed small sections wound tightly and placed close together. A woman who wanted something between these extremes the controlled but not rigid curl of the most ubiquitous everyday hairstyle of the period, needed to understand both principles simultaneously and apply them across the contours of a head that was not flat and not regular, that had a crown and a nape and temples and hairline, each of which required a slightly different approach. Drying was the element of the pin curl process, most subject to variation, and most consequential in its results. Wet hair was heavy, and would, if left to dry without support, gradually loosen the clip's grip on the wound section, causing the coil to relax before the hair shaft had fully set in its new curl shape. The most reliable method was the hooded hairdryer, which circulated warm, even heat across the entire head simultaneously, reducing drying time to approximately 30 to 45 minutes, and producing consistent results across all sections regardless of their position on the head. The portable home dryer, which resembled a plastic bonnet attached to a hose connected to a box that resembled a small vacuum cleaner, was by the mid-1950s a fixture in a significant percentage of American homes, not universal, but common enough that its absence was notable. Women without dryers relied on air drying, which could take 2 to 4 hours for thick hair, and which required patience, a warm room, and a willingness to sit with a head full of metal clips for longer than was strictly comfortable. The removal of the clips was a moment of private theatre, what might fairly be called the reveal of a process that has been conducted entirely in private, a transformation completed in the bathroom before the bathroom door opened. Each clip was removed in the reverse order of its installation, the coils falling open as the spring released, the wave or curl springing into its new shape, which was for a moment somewhat tighter than the finished style would show, the hair needing a brushing to distribute and soften the individual curls into a unified whole. This final brushing, firm enough to blend, gentle enough not to destroy, was the last technical skill in the process, the one that converted a head covered in perfect but separate little coils into the flowing, integrated hairstyle that would be presented to the world. Women who could not make this transition successfully, who combed too hard or too little, who could not feel the moment when the hair had been blended enough and not too much, found themselves with either an undifferentiated frizz or a set of distinct curls that looked unmistakably like curls that had just come out of clips. The goal was to look as though you had always looked this way, as though this wave had simply grown from your head in this configuration. The goal was the erasure of the technique. The technique, performed in private, was the delivery system. The finished hairstyle was the lie, the beautiful, deliberate, magnificent lie. The cultural meaning of the pin curl's privacy extended beyond the merely practical, in an era that maintained a significant and carefully policed distinction between public and private self, between the woman who stepped out of the house and the woman who lived inside it. The pin curl set was the most visible marker of the private self's ongoing labour on behalf of the public one. To see a woman in her pin curl clips was to see her in the middle of a process of production, the same position that seeing a painter in front of an unfinished canvas occupies in relation to seeing the finished painting in a gallery. The clips telegraphed work. They telegraphed the fact that the polished, composed woman who would appear in public later in the day was not a natural phenomenon, but a manufactured one, assembled through specific technical effort from materials that, without that effort, would have looked quite different. This is perhaps why the pin curl set was so consistently conducted in private, in the domestic spaces that the 1950s carefully shielded from public visibility. Women did not set their hair in public in the way that they might touch up their powder or apply lipstick at a restaurant table. both gestures that the period had decided were acceptable expressions of public feminine self-maintenance. The pin curl was backstage work. The lipstick touch-up was a performance permitted in the drawing room. The distinction was maintained not through any explicit rule, but through the shared cultural understanding of what kinds of feminine effort were acceptable to witness and what kinds required concealment. The psychological dimension of the nightly setting ritual has received relatively little scholarly attention, perhaps because it is difficult to document and perhaps because it falls into that large category of female domestic practice that the historical record has consistently undervalued. But the accounts that survive, in memoirs, in oral history projects, in the occasional magazine column that address the inner life of domestic routine, suggest that the pin curl set was, for many women, a genuinely meaningful private ritual. It was a time of solitude in households that did not always offer solitude easily. It was a time of quiet physical self-attention, of hands working through one's own hair with a care and patience that daily life rarely required or permitted. Some women describe the process in terms that suggest something very close to meditation, the systematic movement through the head, section by section, each coil wound and clipped, the same action repeated with minor variations until the entire head was covered and the work was done, and there was nothing left to do but sit under the dryer and wait. The waiting, too, was part of the ritual. The hooded dryer, humming warm over a head covered in clips, created a cocoon of imposed stillness. The physical impossibility of doing much of anything useful while wearing a dryer hood gave women of the period a legitimized reason to sit still, to read a magazine, to do nothing that could be described as productive. In a domestic culture that measured feminine virtue in large part through visible productivity, through the visible outputs of cooking, cleaning, childcare, social organization, the hairdryer offered an interlude that was structured around waiting rather than doing, and that could not reasonably be interrupted by demands for other labour. The pin curl set from this angle looks less like a maintenance routine and more like a small recurring act of legitimate self-withdrawal. 20 minutes under the dryer, nothing asked of you, nothing produced, only the hair drying toward its finished shape. The end of the pin curl era arrived not as a dramatic repudiation, but as a gradual technical obsolescence. The hot roller, introduced commercially in the early 1960s, reduced the setting time for comparable wave and curl results from overnight or 2 to 4 hours of dryer time to approximately 20 minutes of sitting with heated rollers in place. The trade-off was that hot rollers produced a slightly less even, slightly less long-lasting set than the cold-wet pin curl method, but for women navigating the accelerating pace of mid-decade life, women who were increasingly working outside the home, whose schedules offered diminishing windows of unstructured domestic time, the trade-off was entirely acceptable. The pin curl persisted in professional beauty school curricula, where it remains to this day a foundational licensing examination technique, but it gradually withdrew from the daily domestic practice of most women, becoming instead a specialized technique used by stylists with particular clients for particular occasions, or by the growing community of vintage beauty enthusiasts who understood it as historical practice and engaged with it as such. What the pin curl left behind in the women who had practiced it regularly for years was a specific form of tactile knowledge, an understanding of how wet hair responds to pressure, how a wound section behaves as it dries, how the relationship between tension and curl size plays out across the irregular geography of a human head. This knowledge was not transferable through description alone. It lived in the hands. Women who had set their hair in pin curls every week for a decade knew something about hair that could not be acquired through any other means, and this knowledge, embodied and practical, was the kind that tends to disappear when the practice that sustained it falls out of common use. The pin curl's technical legacy is preserved in beauty school textbooks. Its embodied legacy is preserved in the hands of the women who set their hair that way, who are in their 80s and 90s now, who might still, if you ask them gently, be able to show you how it was done. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in September of 1956, wearing his hair in a structure that rose from the crown of his head in a sweeping brilliantined wave before cresting and falling back over his forehead, the switchboards of the CBS network lit up with calls from viewers who found the performance, in the censorious language of the period, objectionable. The objections were directed primarily at his hips, whose movements the cameras below the waist declined to capture. But some callers found the hair equally alarming, a point of departure from masculine convention that felt to certain observers like a declaration of something they were not quite equipped to name. What none of the CBS switchboard callers appear to have noted, and what has largely escaped the attention of popular histories of the pompadour in America, is that the style Elvis wore that evening had been circulating in women's hairdressing for the better part of a decade before he arrived on television, and that the women who had developed and perfected it in that period had done so for reasons that had nothing to do with rock and roll and everything to do with what the 1950s understood as personal authority. The pompadour as a women's style in the post-war decade was not a direct borrowing from the historical Marquise de Pompadour, though she remains its nominal ancestor, the 18th century French aristocrat whose taste for elaborately elevated hairdressing gave the style its name and its initial cultural cachet. The mid-century women's pompadour was instead a specific product of the wartime upswept styles, the victory rolls, the high crown configurations that had served practical and symbolic purposes during the war years, translated through the aesthetic sensibility of the post-war era into something sleeker, more controlled, more architecturally deliberate. Where the wartime upswept styles had been exuberant in a way that bordered on improvisation, the pompadour of the 1950s was disciplined, its wave precisely shaped, its surface polished to a reflective smoothness that advertised the effort behind it without revealing the mechanics of how that effort had been applied. The creation of the women's pompadour began at the crown, where a section of hair approximately 3 inches wide was gathered and swept upward and forward over the forehead, then turned back upon itself in a wave that rolled toward the top of the head. This wave was the style's defining feature, the architectural element that gave the pompadour its visual grammar, and it required a specific combination of technique and product to execute correctly. The hair needed to be first set on large rollers at the crown to establish the wave's direction and volume, then dried completely, then removed from the rollers and shaped with a brush and hand into the final wave configuration before spray was applied to hold it in place. The timing of the spray was critical. Applied too early, before the wave was fully shaped, it could interfere with the brushing and produce a stiff, unmanageable surface. Applied too late, after the hair had settled into a position that was almost right, it could lock in a shape that was subtly wrong in ways that would be visible in photographs all day and unrecoverable without washing the hair and starting over. Products played a central role, and the post-war decade offered an expanding array of options for the specific needs of the pompadour. Brilliantine, in its newer non-oil-based formulations, was used to add the reflective surface that photographs required without producing the heavy, wet-looking result that traditional brilliantine could cause. A product called pomade, A thicker, more holding preparation, usually based on petroleum jelly or lanolin, combined with a fragrant oil, was used in very small quantities, warmed between the palms and applied sparingly to the wave, to contribute sheen and to help maintain the wave's shape against the flattening effects of movement and humidity. The paradox of pomade, as every women's magazine of the period eventually noted, was that the amount needed to produce the desired effect was almost impossible to estimate correctly. Too little, and the wave fell flat. Too much, and the hair looked unwashed, which in the 1950s was a social catastrophe of considerable magnitude. The women who wore the pompadour most conspicuously in the early to mid-1950s were often, though not exclusively, associated with the professional world in ways that distinguished them from the domestic ideal that dominated most of the period's imagery of femininity. Businesswomen, doctors, lawyers, the relatively small but not negligible population of women in professional careers during the Eisenhower years tended to gravitate towards styles that combined the expected markers of feminine grooming with a visual authority that the more overtly decorative styles of the era did not provide. The pompadour's height and smooth polished wave communicated a kind of gravity that complemented a professional context, suggested a person who had thought about her appearance and arrived at a considered conclusion rather than simply following the most popular style in the current fashion magazines. It was a choice, and choices carried a different social weight than conventions. When rockabilly music arrived from the American South in the mid-1950s, carried by Sun Records artists whose style drew from both country music and rhythm and blues, the pompadour became, briefly, intensely, and with enormous cultural consequences, a style shared between men and women in a way that was genuinely unusual for the period. The female rockabilly singers who performed at the Louisiana Hayride and the Grand Ole Opry, and who appeared in the independent films and television programs that covered this music, wore their pompadours with an attitude that borrowed from the masculine version's associations with toughness and independence without fully assimilating to it. Wanda Jackson's pompadour, seen in photographs from the mid-decade, is emphatically feminine in its finish. Polished, precisely shaped, clearly the product of the same setting and spraying and careful construction as any beauty parlour updo, but it sits on her head with a weight that is not tentative, not apologetic, not particularly interested in being decorative. It is interested in being there. The meeting of this tradition with Elvis on national television in the autumn of 1956 was not, therefore, a moment of masculine invention encountering a neutral hairstyling landscape. It was a moment of visible gender boundary crossing in a culture that had spent a decade negotiating exactly where those boundaries were located. The pompadour on a woman was authority expressed through conventional feminine channels. Beauty, grooming, personal presentation. The pompadour on a man was the same structure imported into a context where it carried different weight, different associations, different social risks. The Ed Sullivan callers who found Elvis's hair alarming were not wrong to find it historically significant, even if their analysis of its significance was somewhat imprecise. The style had always carried a charge. It was just that the charge, for the first time, was running through a man's hair on national television, and the CBS switchboard was not equipped to handle the current. The male pompadour's cultural trajectory from mid-century signifier to global style archetype runs through several distinct phases, each of which added layers of meaning to the basic structure of the swept and rolled wave. After Elvis, the pompadour became associated with rockabilly and later with the broader category of greaser style, a working-class leather-jacketed aesthetic that positioned itself in deliberate contrast to the crew-cut, preppy conventions of mainstream mid-century masculinity. The Brylcreem advertisements of the period, with their images of smooth, shining, controlled waves over clean-cut faces, represented one pole of masculine grooming aspiration. The pompadour, worn with more grease and more height, represented the other, the style as rebellion rather than conformity, as personality rather than convention. What makes this trajectory interesting in the context of women's styling history is that the rebellion the male pompadour represented was built on a foundation that women had established. The style's vocabulary, the gathering, the wave, the height, the role of product in achieving and maintaining the shape, had been developed in women's salons and on women's heads throughout the early part of the decade, before Elvis brought it to television in a configuration that the culture encoded as masculine and transgressive. The women who had worn the pompadour in 1952 and 1953 had not been encoded as transgressive. They'd been encoded as stylish. The same hairstyle, transferred across a gender line and set against a soundtrack of electric guitar, became something that CBS cameras declined to show below the waist. The style itself had not changed. The body it sat on, and the cultural assumptions that surrounded that body, had changed everything. The products that enabled the mid-century pompadour, for both its female and male practitioners, tell a story about the intersection of chemistry, marketing, and aspiration that is characteristic of the post-war consumer economy at large. Murray's Superior Hair Dressing Pomade, which had been manufactured on the south side of Chicago since 1925, became a standard pompadour product for both black and white rockabilly musicians in the 1950s, its heavy petroleum base providing the hold that the style's wave required, and its distinctive tin packaging providing a retro aesthetic that was, in retrospect, perfectly suited to the nostalgia-tinged rebel presentation of the style's practitioners. Brylcreem, the British product introduced to American markets in the early 1950s, occupied the more mainstream end of the pomade spectrum. Lighter, less holding, promoted through advertisements that associated it with conventional masculine attractiveness, rather than with any particular subculture. The women who wore the pompadour in the 1950s were navigating a more complex product landscape, working with formulations designed for feminine styling needs, the lighter pomades and hairdresses that added sheen without the heaviness of masculine petroleum-based products. The marketing language that surrounded these products was scrupulously feminine in its framing, emphasizing elegance and polish rather than the swagger and attitude that characterized the male pompadour products of the same era. The style was the same. The product was different. The market was divided along gender lines with a precision that served both the beauty industry's commercial interests and the culture's need to maintain categorical clarity about what belonged to whom. The pompadour in the 1950s ultimately tells a story about how hairstyles carry meaning across and between genders, how a shape can travel from a beauty parlor in Cincinnati to a television studio in New York, and emerge as something culturally transformed without having changed a single geometric feature. The women who wore it first were not precursors to Elvis. They were wearing their own style for their own reasons, operating within their own aesthetic culture. But the style's mobility across gender lines, and the very different cultural charges it acquired in each gender context, reveals something about how style works as a language, how the same grammatical structure produces different meanings depending on the speaker, the audience, and the cultural context in which the communication occurs. The pompadour said something. What it said depended entirely on who was wearing it and what the room expected to hear. The contemporary practitioners of the women's pompadour, and they exist in considerable numbers, particularly in the communities devoted to vintage aesthetics and mid-century style, are in a position to observe this history with a clarity that was not available to the style's original wearers. To choose the pompadour today as a woman is to make a choice that is saturated with cultural history, that references both the mid-century women who developed it in beauty parlours and the rockabilly singers who wore it on stages, and the pop cultural mythology that has grown up around all of them. The contemporary wearer is in dialogue with this history whether she intends to be or not. The style carries its baggage, and the baggage is interesting. Stories about authority and rebellion, about gender and style, about who gets to claim a shape, and what happens when the same shape claims different meanings in different mouths. The pompadour is still available. The complexity is included. In the summer of 1932, at the height of the American economic crisis, the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, one of the nation's most successful black-owned beauty businesses, published a training manual for its network of licensed agents that included a full chapter on the finger wave and its relationship to professional credibility. The manual was blunt in its assessment. The agent who could not finger wave, it stated without qualification, was an agent who could not be taken seriously. This was not merely a technical assessment. It was a judgment about the minimum competency required to operate in a market where women needed their hair to look cared for, looked after, precisely styled even when, especially when, money was not available for the kind of elaborate salon appointments that more prosperous times had supported. The finger wave was the Depression-era hairstyle, not because it was cheap. It required skill that was not easily or quickly acquired, but because, once mastered, it could be executed with water, a comb, and 2 hands. No equipment, no current, no recurring investment, just knowledge applied to wet hair. The technique itself was ancient in its basic gesture, but modern in its mid-century application. To understand a finger wave, you need to visualize the S-curve, the flowing, alternating arc that the style produces when viewed from the side or above, the hair undulating in smooth, deep ridges like the surface of water filmed just after a stone has struck it. These ridges were created by a continuous alternation of finger position and comb direction, with the index finger holding each completed ridge in place, while the comb was drawn through the hair beside it to create the next ridge, then the finger repositioning ahead of the comb to hold that ridge while the comb moved on, the whole process travelling steadily from the part line across the crown and down through the sides, in a choreography that looked, to the untrained eye, impossibly fluid, and, to anyone who had practiced it, was barely distinguishable from breathing. The directional setting lotion applied before the waving began was as important as the hand position. A setting lotion in the 1930s and 40s was typically a light gel compound based on quince seed mucilage, an ingredient extracted from the seeds of the quince fruit, which produced a viscous, clear gel when soaked in water, and which had the critical quality of keeping hair manageable and slow drying during the waving process, without adding weight that would pull the ridges out of shape. Quince seed preparations went under various trade names. Luster cream was one, and bergamot was another, and there were dozens of house brands manufactured for individual salon chains and distributed in the plain glass bottles that characterized professional beauty supply packaging of the era. A hairdresser who preferred a stiffer hold would use more lotion and apply it more thoroughly. One working with very fine hair, which had a tendency to overwave and lose definition, would use less, relying more on the precise positioning of the fingers and comb to maintain the ridge geometry. The setting net, applied after the waves were formed and before the client sat under the dryer, was the final element of the technique, and it served a function that was both practical and slightly ceremonial. Practically, the net held the completed wave pattern flat against the scalp during drying, preventing the ridges from shifting or collapsing under the movement of air through the dryer hood. Ceremonially, and this is perhaps an overstatement, but perhaps not entirely, the net marked the completion of the styling work, the point at which the hairdresser's active involvement concluded and the dryer's passive heat took over. A client in a setting net under a dryer was a client in transit, moving from one state to another, and the dryer's warmth was the mechanism of that transition. What entered as wet hair in careful ridges would emerge as dry hair in fixed ridges. The wave stabilized into something durable by the heat that had drawn the moisture out of it. The finger wave's relationship to Black American beauty culture in the 1940s and 50s is a chapter of the style's history that mainstream fashion publications of the period largely declined to cover. But that is essential to understanding why the technique survived the decade and arrived intact into the professional beauty curriculum of the 1960s. Black women in the post-war era were styling in a context that was both parallel to and distinct from the mainstream beauty culture that department store advertisements and women's magazines represented. The products available to them, the salons available to them, the beauty schools they could attend and the professional licenses they could obtain all existed in a commercial landscape shaped by segregation, by the specific consumer market that black-owned beauty companies had built in response to exclusion from mainstream distribution, and by the technical traditions that had been developed within that market across the early decades of the 20th century. The finger wave was central to this tradition. It appeared in every black beauty school curriculum of the period as a foundational skill, alongside the pressing and relaxing techniques that manage the specific texture of black hair in the context of mid-century beauty standards. The wave itself was a versatile technique that worked beautifully on the pressed, straightened hair that was the dominant styling treatment of the era, producing a close, controlled wave pattern that sat flat to the head and maintained its definition through the humidity and heat of summer in a way that roller sets sometimes did not. And the black beauty salon was the context in which the technique was most consistently taught, most carefully preserved, and most artfully applied throughout the 1950s, when mainstream fashion culture was increasingly focused on the Bouffant and the Beehive and the pageboy styles that defined the period's dominant aesthetic. By 1960, the finger wave had largely disappeared from mainstream salon menus, replaced by the more voluminous styling techniques that suited the decade's preference for height and mass. But it had not disappeared from beauty schools, where it remained a standard component of the licensing examination curriculum in most states, a technical proof that a student had mastered the fundamental relationship between wet hair, applied pressure, and a comb. Students who passed the finger wave portion of their licensing exam and then went to work in suburban salons often never used the technique again in professional practice, but they carried the knowledge, the physical understanding of how hair moves when water and oil and a practiced hand engage with it, and that understanding was the substrate on which every subsequent technique was built. The finger wave was a dead language that remained somehow the language that everything else was translated from. The relationship between the finger wave and the beauty school curriculum deserves a closer examination than it typically receives in histories of American cosmetology education. The technique appeared in state licensing examination requirements, not merely because it was historically important, but because it was pedagogically irreplaceable. A single technique that required and therefore revealed a student's mastery of multiple foundational skills simultaneously. To execute a finger wave correctly, a student needed to demonstrate fine motor control of the comb and the non-dominant hand together, which meant she had to have moved past the stage of thinking about each individual action and into the stage of coordinated automatic movement. She needed to understand the relationship between the amount of moisture in the hair and the degree of control available. Too wet, and the ridges would not hold their shape. Too dry, and the hair would not move at all. And she needed to demonstrate aesthetic judgment, the ability to read the wave as it was developing and make adjustments in pressure and direction that kept the pattern consistent across the irregular surface of a human head. No other single technique in the cosmetology examination required all of these competencies simultaneously. The roller set required motor control, but not the same fine-grained real-time judgment. The permanent wave required chemical knowledge, but the manual component was relatively straightforward. The haircut required aesthetic judgment, but of a different kind, more spatial and less time-sensitive than the judgment demanded by the moving, developing finger wave. In combining all of these in a single technique, the finger wave served as what educators would today call an integrated assessment, a task that revealed, in the process of its execution, the student's overall readiness to work on actual human heads in actual professional settings. The practitioners who carried the finger wave tradition most consistently through the decades of its mainstream decline were, as has been noted, largely but not exclusively located in black beauty salon culture. What is worth adding is that this was not merely a matter of cultural continuity for its own sake. The finger wave remained practically relevant in black salons because the styling needs of black clients, which included a wide range of hair textures from tightly coiled to chemically relaxed to natural, required a broader technical repertoire than the mid-century mainstream market had settled on. A stylist who could only set rollers and backcomb was a specialist. A stylist who could also finger wave, who understood how to work with wet hair under precise manual control, was a generalist in the fullest sense, capable of adapting her technique to whatever the client's hair required rather than adapting the client's hair to whatever technique the stylist preferred. The finger wave also survived in attenuated but genuine form in the category of edgework, the styling of the hair at the hairline and temples that was, and remains, an important element of several black hairstyling traditions. The precise waving and sculpting of the hairline, executed with a fine-tooth comb and a light-holding gel, uses the same basic principles as the finger wave applied to a very narrow region of the head. Stylists who had internalized the finger wave's logic of pressure, moisture, and direction found this edgework natural. Stylists who had not learned the finger wave found it considerably more challenging. The technique was a foundation that supported more than the obvious structure built on top of it. The most recent revival of interest in the finger wave in mainstream beauty culture, driven in part by the neo-20s aesthetic that appeared on runways and in music videos in the 2010s, has exposed contemporary practitioners to a technique that many beauty school graduates of the period had never been taught with any depth. The revival produced a crop of tutorial videos, magazine features, and product launches designed to support the newly interested audience, and the products themselves were revealing. The quince seed gels of the 1930s had given way to commercially produced wave-setting gels with similar viscosity and purpose, packaged in sleek minimalist packaging that would have been unrecognizable to the stylists of the Depression era, but that contained, in their basic chemical action, something very close to what those stylists had applied from plain glass bottles. The product had been modernized. The technique had not changed. The finger wave moved through a woman's hair the same way it always had. Index finger forward, comb following, ridge held while the next ridge formed. The century of intervening time had not found a better way to do it. The finger wave status as a foundational beauty school technique ensures that it will not disappear from professional hairdressing as long as professional hairdressing requires licensed practitioners and licensing requires examination. But its survival in this administrative sense is somewhat different from survival as a living practice, and the distinction matters. A technique preserved in examination requirements is preserved in the way that a language is preserved in a grammar textbook, accurately, structurally, but without the warmth of everyday use. The finger wave as a living practice exists where it has always existed most fully, in the hands of practitioners who perform it regularly, for clients who value the result, in the specific cultural and social context where its particular combination of precision, control, and understated elegance has always been appreciated. Those contexts have shifted over the decades, but they have not disappeared. The finger wave, like the women who developed it in Depression-era salons with nothing but water and a comb, and the knowledge in their hands, has proven more durable than the circumstances that originally produced it. In 1953, Audrey Hepburn walked out of a Manhattan salon with a haircut that American cinema had never seen on a leading lady before, and that American women would spend the next several years trying to achieve in salons that were not entirely prepared for what they had been asked to do. The cut was short, shorter than the page boy, shorter than the poodle cut, shorter than anything that had been fashionable since the 1920s, and it was textured in a way that was almost casual, with no set curl, no disciplined wave, no elaborate architecture. It was, in a word that would have seemed paradoxical as a compliment in almost any other decade, messy. Not actually messy, obviously. The level of skill required to produce hair that looked this unstudied was considerable, and was delivered by the Italian hairdresser Grazia de Rossi, who had given Hepburn the cut for the film Roman Holiday, and whose technique would eventually be reverse-engineered by beauty schools on 3 continents, but messy in its deliberate disavowal of the controlled, lacquered, engineered aesthetic that had dominated the first years of the decade. The Italian boy, as the style came to be called, was not a break from the 1950s so much as a fissure in them, a crack through which a different idea of what a woman could look like had begun to enter. The name itself was a small act of cultural appropriation that told you exactly where the style located its authority. It was Italian, which in the context of early 1950s, American aspiration meant both old world and new cinema. The neo-realist films of De Sica and Rossellini, the streets of Rome as they appeared in films made in actual Roman streets, rather than on backlots, filled with women who looked unrehearsed in ways that American studio productions did not permit. And it was boy, an adjective applied to a woman's hairstyle as a mark of liberation rather than insult, a borrowing of masculine brevity and ease that the style's practitioners considered straightforwardly flattering. To have the Italian boy was to be compared, in a very specific and controlled way, to a young man in Rome, which was in 1953 a comparison that carried associations of freedom and movement, and the absence of domestic enclosure that a significant number of American women found appealing. The cut's technical requirements were demanding in ways that differed from the demands of the decade's other styles. The Bouffant and the Beehive required products, tools, and a tolerance for architectural commitment. The pin curl required patience and the systematic application of a learnable technique. The Italian boy required scissors. Specifically, it required scissors operated by someone who understood that the cut's apparent simplicity was a product of precise geometric decisions about length, graduation, and texture that, if executed incorrectly, produced not the desired studied nonchalance, but simply an uneven, short haircut with no redeeming charm. The distinction between the two outcomes was visible immediately and not correctable without growing the hair back. The cutting technique most commonly associated with the style in the trade literature of the period was point cutting, the use of scissors held at an angle to the hair shaft rather than parallel to it, so that each cut produced a feathered, slightly varied end rather than the blunt, even line of conventional scissor work. Point cutting removed bulk from the ends of the sections, preventing the heavy, helmet-like finish that a straight cut of the same length would have produced, and creating instead the soft, diffuse edge that gave the style its slightly undone quality. It was a technique that had existed in the hairdresser's repertoire for decades, but that had been largely irrelevant in an era devoted to smooth, polished, precisely finished surfaces. The Italian boy rehabilitated it, made it central, gave it the status of a signature technique rather than a remedial adjustment. The women who adopted the Italian boy in the early to mid-1950s tended to cluster in ways that reflected the style's cultural associations. Younger women, particularly those in urban environments, particularly those with some connection, however indirect, to the arts, to academia, to the progressive intellectual culture that was beginning to articulate what would become the feminist critique of the decade's domestic ideal. These women found the Italian boy compelling in a way that went beyond its aesthetic appeal, though its aesthetic appeal was genuine and considerable. To cut your hair this short, this differently in 1954 was to opt out of a significant portion of the mid-century beauty ritual. No setting, no rolling, no spraying, no architectural morning construction, and to opt into something that read, to those who were paying attention, as a statement about what one did and did not consider worth one's time. The salon industry of the period was not uniformly equipped to deliver the result that the style's admirers sought. American beauty school curricula of the early 1950s were structured around the permanent wave and the pin curl set as the foundational techniques of women's styling, with cutting treated as a preparation for setting rather than as the primary technical act in its own right. A stylist trained in this curriculum and presented with a photograph of Hepburn's Roman holiday cut was working from a skill set that had not been specifically developed for the demands of precision shortcutting, and the results, as documented in the letters to beauty editors that magazines like Glamour published throughout the mid-decade, were sometimes disappointing in ways that the clients found difficult to articulate and the stylists found difficult to hear. The problem was not effort, it was preparation. By 1958, the style had evolved into several related variations that reflected different interpretations of its core principle. The principle that a woman's hair could be short, could be relatively unadorned, could refuse the elaborate structure that the decade's prevailing aesthetic demanded, and could be, in its refusal, its own form of glamour, the gamine cut, associated particularly with images of Jean Seberg in the French film Breathless, pushed brevity further, eliminating even the slight softness of the Italian boy in favour of something approaching a traditional men's cut in its geometry. The modified Italian boy, which most salon clients actually received when they brought in the Hepburn photographs, was a version in which the extreme brevity was moderated to something approaching the longer version of the page boy, retaining the texture and casual edge of the original, while conceding to the practical reality that most American women's salons in 1955 had one pair of thinning shears and a stylist who had learned to cut hair in the context of permanent waves. The Italian boy did not win the 1950s, the Bouffant won the 1950s, with the Beehive as a close second, and the Page boy remained the decade's most reliable workhorse of everyday elegance. But the Italian boy established something in the cultural record that the following decade would build on with extraordinary momentum. The idea that a woman's hair could be genuinely short, could be cut rather than set, could rely on shape rather than volume for its beauty, and to do all of this while being recognizably, unmistakably feminine. When the 1960s arrived and brought with them Vidal Sassoon's geometric cuts, his 5-point bob, his architectural precision cutting that dispensed with setting entirely, and insisted that the cut was the style, the foundation for this revolution was already in place. It had been laid down in a Roman studio in 1952, when a young actress walked into a barber's chair and came out looking like no one's wife, no one's secretary, no one's domestic ideal. She looked, simply, like herself. And that was the whole point. The techniques that Vidal Sassoon would codify in his famous 5-point bob and the subsequent geometric cuts of the mid-1960s were, in their essential structure, an extension and a refinement of the principle that the Italian boy had introduced, that cutting was the primary event, that the shape existed in the cut itself rather than in the setting applied afterward, and that a well-cut head of hair required nothing between the scissors and the finish style except the correct geometric decisions at each point of contact between blade and hair shaft. Sassoon acknowledged the influence of the Bauhaus design movement on his thinking, which was accurate as far as it went, but the Italian boy's influence on his formative years as a stylist in London in the late 1950s was something he also documented. He had seen what happened when a woman walked out of a salon with hair that didn't need to be set, with a cut precise enough to be its own style, and he had recognized in that event the future of the profession he was entering. The 5-point bob that made him famous in 1963 was, among other things, a development of an idea that had been visible in a Roman studio a decade earlier. The women who had worn the Italian boy in the early to mid-1950s were, in most cases, not thinking of themselves as harbingers of a revolution. They were thinking about how they looked. They were thinking about the 20 minutes they had saved in the morning by not having to set rollers. They were thinking about the fact that the cut held its shape through wind and rain in a way that a set hairstyle did not, that it looked good on Thursday in a way that a roller set typically did not, that it suited the increasingly mobile and active daily life that more women were living, the jobs, the commutes, the expanding set of contexts in which women appeared in public spaces, including public spaces that had not traditionally been considered part of the feminine social geography. The Italian boy was, in this reading, not merely an aesthetic preference, but a practical adaptation to a changing world, a hairstyle that suited women who were moving faster, appearing in more places, managing more simultaneous social roles than the domestic ideal of the early part of the decade had envisioned or required. The Bouffant and the Beehive were beautiful in contexts of relative stillness, dinner parties, formal gatherings, occasions at which one arrived and remained, in which the structure of one's hair was not tested by movement or weather or the simple passage of several active hours. The Italian boy was beautiful in motion. It stayed beautiful through motion. It was, in the terminology of an era that had not yet coined the concept, a style with a different relationship to the demands of modern life. The question of what the 1960s inherited from the hairstyle culture of the 1950s is one that tends to focus on the obvious disruptions, The long, straight, natural hair of the folk revival, the geometric precision cutting of the British invasion, the explicit political meaning of the afro as a statement against the beauty standards that had required black women to chemically alter their hair to participate in mainstream feminine culture. These were genuine disruptions, and they mattered enormously. But they were also built on, and in several cases directly descended from, developments that had already occurred within the decade they were repudiating. The poodle cut had demonstrated that short hair could be unambiguously feminine. The Italian boy had demonstrated that brevity did not require elaborate setting to produce a beautiful result. The women who wore the pompadour had demonstrated that women could claim the visual language of authority and swagger without relinquishing their identity as women. The finger wave practitioners had maintained a technical tradition that would persist into the century's next chapter. The beehive had pushed height and structure to their logical extreme, and in doing so had perhaps prepared the culture for the idea that there was a logical extreme, that the direction of more and more elaborate had a ceiling, and that reaching the ceiling might create an appetite for something simpler. The hairstyles of the 1950s were not merely the background against which the 1960s happened. They were the material that the 60s worked with, the clay that the next decade shaped into something new, using hands that had learned their craft in the decades before.